It's good to be with you.
Good to go, Dr. Jackson.
Okay, very good. Um, it's good to see you all today. I'm here with a pillar of my self-care, which is Diet Coke. Not the healthiest, probably not the worst thing you could do either, though. And I do think it helps me a bit. It is a bit of a crutch, but you'll never find me very far without a Diet Coke in my hand. So we're talking today about a topic that is actually very important, and certainly dear to my heart, and I trust dear to yours. And that has to do very broadly with issues of morale and resilience and self-care. And we should start by acknowledging that these are terms that are ill-defined. What is self-care exactly? I think people would characterize it differently, but I think in general it has to do with this notion, this imperative that attending to our own needs, not only the needs of our patients, is something that we should, and indeed something that we must prioritize. And we'll talk about ways to do that. Resilience also is a term that is hard to define, but I think it has to do with this general notion that when you get knocked down, you keep on getting up. People of a certain age might remember Weebles. Does anybody remember Weebles? I
I
don't know
do.
if I'm looking for a show of hands or not. Yeah, somebody does. But back in the day, there was a barrage of advertising on TV. People remember, right? Weebles wobble, but they don't what? Fill in the blank. Weebles wobble, but they
Fall down.
don't fall down. So if you were like me, I'd take my forefinger and I'd tweak a Weeble, and the Weeble would fall backwards, and the Weeble would eventually uh, stand erect, right? Stand back up. Weebles wobble and they don't fall down. Well, I've never heard of Weebles described as resilient, but this, I think, is what we're talking about, that some people have the capacity to get knocked down and to get back up. And some people have the capacity to be knocked down multiple times and get back up. And I'm going to call that resilience. Now, the solution to that challenge isn't only to get better at getting back up. It is partly, at least, to learn how to not get knocked down. And it is to try to change structures and organizational dynamics and all of that so that you don't get knocked down. But getting back up is really essential, and that's resilience. And I think often when we think of resilience, too often in our head, the image we associate with resilience is a soldier in combat, someone going to war, men storming the beach at Normandy, let's say. That's resilience. And I think an alternate view of resilience would be that it is more like taking a nap. It is more like going for a walk. It's more like being in nature. That often gentler things are the things that help foster in us a deep reserve of resilience. And the idea basically here, and this has been very true, I think, for many during the pandemic, is that you're basically making deposits in your mental health bank, and the more deposits you make, the more money there is to withdraw when you need it. And this, I think, is the concept that we want to be talking about and leaning into, which is that in an ongoing way, you want to be caring for yourself. You want to be building up your reserves, so to speak, your mental health reserves. And I'm aware there's nothing impressive about this flexing, but it's just a metaphor here, right? So you're building up your mental health reserves so that when you need them, you reach back in and grab them, and they're there. That's this general idea of the value of self-care, because I think what we find is that when you're in a crisis or a difficult situation, it's very hard then to stockpile the reserves. So what we want to be fostering is this idea that I'm building up those mental health reserves and those coping reserves. I'm doing it on a daily basis. I'm doing it continuously. And I'm not waiting until I'm in a crisis to do it. Because if I wait until I'm in a crisis to do it, it's effectively too late. How do we do this? How do we build up our reserves? Well, I think the first place we start is with an honest conversation about the fact that we need to do this. I think that's where we start. And that's basic and it's very elemental, but nonetheless, it's really critical because I think often, in this country at least, and in the current environment we're in at least, I think many of us on some level, until recently at least, have not really believed that we need to build those reserves up, right? The idea of self-care might be something that someone else does. It's not something that I need, right? Many of you are where you're at. You've achieved what you've achieved by hard work, by the force of your will, by determination, by being willing to work long hours, all the things. And some of the lessons you think you've learned are lessons that we are inviting people increasingly to unlearn, which are, let's stop being so independent, right? Let's start relying on other people more than only ourselves. Let's stop pushing ourselves to the limit. Let's stop those things. But we start by considering the possibility that there's a problem, right? So I like to lean on and rely on something called stages of change theory. And stages of change theory is quite a robust model of how people in situations change. And it was developed by a psychologist, James Prochaska, who I think was at the University of Delaware or some university in the Northeast. And here's what he said when he developed stages of change theory. He said that change exists over a series of stages. The first one is pre-contemplation. That's followed by contemplation, which is followed by action, which is followed by maintenance, okay? Pre-contemplation is the idea that, let's take smoking as an example, and I'll relate this back to self-care. Pre-contemplation is the idea that I'm not really thinking in a serious way about stopping smoking, but I'm thinking about the idea that one day I need to think about it, right? I'm thinking about thinking about it. As I move to contemplation, I'm now actively thinking about it, and I'm not that far from actually doing it. So I'm going to suggest that some of you may be ready to act on this idea that, gosh, I need to start taking care of myself. I need to do that as a primary goal. I need to start taking care of myself. Some of you are not quite there yet, in truth. Some of you may be at the place where you say, I'm thinking about taking care of myself. And some of you, and this is the invitation I'm giving, may be at the basic stage, which is where I often am with self-care, which is, gosh, I need to start considering that this is even a problem, right? Let's at least invite you to drink of the well of thinking about the possibility that you need to begin leaning into self-care, right? As a way of handling the stress that just keeps coming. The stress does keep coming, and it reminds me a lot, living in healthcare in these days reminds me a lot of the game of whack-a-mole. I don't know if anyone remembers whack-a-mole. I know I'm talking about Weebles. I'm talking about whack-a-mole. When our kids were young, we used to love to take them to Chuck E. Cheese. Didn't really go for the pizza, but the kids would play in the, in the ball pit, which in the pandemic era sounds pretty germ-filled. Anyway, we would go to Chuck E. Cheese, and my favorite game was whack-a-mole. And if you remember whack-a-mole, basically what you've got is you've got a mallet. Imagine I'm holding a mallet here, and then there's this little game. The mallet's on a string, right? And there are all these little holes, and these moles pop their heads up. And when they pop their heads up, you hit them with the mallet, right? And you knock one of them down in this game of whack-a-mole, and you feel kind of satisfied for a second. As soon as you do, two more moles pop their heads up, right? And then you hit those. As soon as you hit those, another one pops its head up. And I think early in the pandemic, especially, what we found was that this was the dynamic, right? This was the dynamic that, gosh, I've got a leak in the dike. I'm plugging it with my thumb. Now I've got a leak somewhere else in the dike. I'm plugging it with my finger. Oh my gosh, there are 4 more leaks. How on earth am I going to plug those, right? It's really difficult. And I think even today, although the dynamics have changed some, a similarity is that we knock one mole down, one more comes up, right? And we kind of barely catch our breath. And I think the truth is, many people, especially in a nursing home context, were so profoundly traumatized by COVID that they're still not back to the place where they have all of their coping resources at their disposal, right? It's really, really hard. It's really, really hard. So, so considering self-care and how to engage that is so important. And let's talk about practical ways to begin to do that. The first one I'm going to talk about that in some ways is easy, but easier said than done, is boundaries, right? Boundaries. So at our house sits up on a hill. At our house, we have a big backyard, and around that backyard is a nice cedar fence. And for argument's sake, let's imagine that the things within that fence are ours, and the things outside of that fence are not. It's not quite that simple, but let's imagine that's the fence. That fence is a boundary. Okay, all of us have boundaries, and how crisp or how malleable we're going to want to make those boundaries is going to influence how resilient we are, and it's going to often influence what we can say yes to. So I'll give an example. Years ago, when my research career was just barely starting to launch, I got a call. This was back when people didn't text, they actually called on the phone. I got a call from someone in Germany, and she said, we want to invite you to a meeting. We want to invite you to the German Psychosomatic Society annual meeting. It's in a town called Jena, Jena, little town in East Germany. And she said, we'd like to ask if you want to do it. And I said, done, I'll do it. And she said, really? Like, don't you want me to tell you about it? And I said, oh, no, it doesn't even matter. I'm going to do it. That was an unwise boundary, because what happened with that talk is I flew to Germany. It was a scene right out of Trains, Planes, and Automobiles. I flew into Berlin. I took a car, I took a train. 8 or 10 hours later, I'm in this little town in Germany. I'm at a meeting with 70 people or so. The entire meeting's in German. I didn't really get paid much of anything. My talk was 10 minutes long. It was a total waste of time. It didn't help me. It didn't help them. But what it did do was it detracted from grant writing, right? It detracted from being engaged with my family for the better part of a week, right? It detracted from important things. And I think often what happens before the pandemic, during, and after is that we can get derailed and harm our own self-care by agreeing to do things that take us away from the mission. Mission might be related to work. The mission might be related to self-care, but the key is trying to figure out what is valuable to us, where are our values, what are our goals, and then acting in ways and setting limits that align with those, right? So saying no to certain things that are stressful if we don't need to do those things, okay? Saying no to things that are going to add to our list of things to do if we don't have the time to do that. Agreeing to things that we probably don't need to agree with or agree to just because that's our impulse, right? These all have to do with boundaries. And let me orient us in how we could think about this. So Stephen Covey, I don't know how many people remember him. He's been gone now. That dear man has been gone now for probably a dozen years or so, but he wrote a lot of famous books. 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. He wrote a book that I think is lesser known, but even better, First Things First. And he talked a lot about priorities and prioritizing. And one of the things he talked about that I think was really powerful was he talked about this idea of a fishbowl. He said, imagine that there's a fishbowl. And imagine that you have big rocks and you have small rocks. If you put the small rocks in the fishbowl first, there is no room then to put in the big rocks. If you put the big rocks in first, though, the small rocks you can pour in and they'll fill the spaces around the big rocks, right? But if you put all the small rocks in first, there's no room for the big rocks. This is an empirical question. You can try it, right? You can test it out. It's true. Put the big rocks in first, you can put the small rocks in. Put the small rocks in, no room though exists for the big rocks. What's the point? The big rocks are important things in your life. Okay, they're important things in your life, and they're the things that you need to attend to first. Okay, and if you attend to those first, again, I'm oversimplifying, but if you attend to those first, everything else kind of falls into place. Okay, but if you deal with the minutia first, often that will derail you from big goals. So observation number one, if we're going to list them this way, let's put the big rocks in first. Okay, let's put the big rocks in first, and let's make decisions and set boundaries that align with our key priorities. Okay, and to the extent that we have control over it, let's set limits and let's not say yes to things that will derail us from what the primary goal is. And the primary goal, at least in part, should have to do with preserving our mental health. Because when I preserve my mental health and my physical health, my well-being, at the end of the day, I'm better for you, right? I'm a better provider. I'm a better employee. I'm a better supervisor. I'm a better manager. I'm a better boss. All of that is better when I prioritize what my needs are. Now, that's counterintuitive because often as healthcare providers, that's not how we think about things, right? I mean, we went into the field that we went into for a variety of reasons, surely. But one of those big reasons probably is we're altruistic, we're other-centered. But if we're giving, and never taking, we're not going to be the people that we need to be. We're not going to be available for the people we need to be available for in the ways that we need to be available for them. So I'm going to invite you to consider at least the possibility that by setting boundaries and setting limits and prioritizing yourself, that's going to make you better in virtually every respect. And this can be a hard decision. And if you're not used to setting boundaries and limits, it can feel really weird. And I would say the way you learn is you try, right? You try it and you might not get it right. And that's okay. There's some great books about boundaries. There's one simply called Boundaries by Henry Cloud and John Townsend. Talks about boundaries from a slightly religious lens, but that doesn't really matter. You can take that aspect of the book and put it on the shelf, and the book Boundaries is very practical, and I would recommend it. So one, let's set boundaries as a way of engaging in self-care and becoming resilient. Two, let's consider being vulnerable with other people about our needs, because it often is in so doing that we're going to get those needs met. And in meeting those needs, again, we're going to become more resilient. So vulnerability has been in the news a lot. It's been top of mind since Brene Brown started writing New York Times best-selling books about it. And vulnerability has a lot to do with acknowledging my needs, whatever those might be, owning those needs, and actually asking people for help. And this can be a challenging thing. And many of us are very loath to do it, right? We're reluctant to talk about our emotions. We're reluctant to ask for help. We're reluctant to tell people that we need anything. And I'm going to invite us to consider a different way. I'll give you an example. In the mid-1990s, I was in graduate school in California. My wife, Michelle, and I were newly married, and we moved from Kalamazoo, Michigan, great place if anybody's been there, to Southern Cal to go to grad school. And we left behind this dynamic community of people that we were really close with, many of them at our church. Some we knew through other contexts, but we left this family of people. They were so helpful for us. And we got to California and we were really lonely. And again, I have a religious faith, my wife and I do. And church historically has kind of been at the center of our lives. And so we moved to California, and I thought, gosh, you know, if we go to a church, there will be people there that can support us. I don't know that I thought, gosh, they can help support my mental health, but that's actually what was happening potentially, right? They were going to help me be a better version of me. They were going to support me. So we instinctively went to a church to try to find these people. And we went to this Sunday school class, and week in, week out, we went. There were all these couples. They looked so nice and happy, and none of them said a thing to us. They didn't say anything to us. And we felt really lonely. And I know I felt even a little bit forlorn. And one day we were driving down Imperial Highway toward Yorba Linda, if anyone's driven down that road. And my wife said, you know, Jim, I think maybe this is the last time that we're going to go to the Sunday school class. Nobody's friendly. They're not engaging us. I feel so alone. And I felt so alone too. So we went to church, and they did the customary thing that they did in this Sunday school. And the teacher stood up and he asked for a prayer request. If people are part of this culture, you get it. And I thought, gosh, it's now or never. And I stood up and I said, hey, I'm Jim Jackson. This is my wife, Michelle. Michelle was crying by now. I was fighting back tears. I felt very exposed, kind of naked. And I said, we're the Jacksons, and hey, we're really having a hard time. We are lonely, and we don't have any friends, and we've been coming here for 6 or 8 weeks now. No one's really talked to us, and we need some help. Oh my gosh, that was a hard thing to do. That might have been almost the hardest thing I'd done. And surprisingly, people didn't kick sand in my face. They didn't scoff. They didn't laugh at me. They actually just rallied around to help us. It was really lovely. We got home, and in those days, everybody had an old school answering machine, right, with a little digital number that said 8 messages or 14 or 20, or it said full. And we had gotten, 14 or 16 messages from people, and they'd said, we want you to go to a hockey game with us. We want you to come over for dinner. Can we go to a picnic together in the park? We're grilling out with some friends. Can you come over? People really reached out to us to support us. But that took me taking my mask of competency off, taking my mask of self-sufficiency off, and being willing to say, hey, I'm about to sink below the waterline here, raising my hand. And it was really humbling. And I think often we're not about that, right? We're not about being vulnerable. We're not easily about expressing our needs to other people. Often we're better at hiding those. I think of that a lot during the Christmas season. Do people get Christmas cards or send them? We don't often do that. This year, it seems like we will. I just dropped some in the mail the other day, so I think we're on target. But one thing I've noticed about Christmas cards is that people usually put their best foot forward, right? So you've got this family, and everybody's dressed beautifully, and they're smiling, and there may even be a somewhat obnoxious letter in the Christmas card that talks about your 5 high achieving kids who are developing vaccines and serving in Africa and graduating #1 in their class at MIT and all those sorts of things. And I often feel pretty inadequate when I read those. But point being, people put their best foots forward, right? Like often we're about image management. And what I'm suggesting is that as a way of self-care, we're going to ditch the image management. Let's ditch the image management. Or if you can't ditch it, which might be ambitious, let's at least reconsider the idea of managing our image. And let's consider the possibility of saying to someone in our circle, hey, I'm having a hard time, right? And it could be over lunch. You don't have to broadcast it at a team meeting, but tell someone, right? This is the first step toward building resilience, being vulnerable. Tell someone. And if you need something from them, ask them. And if you need something from them, ask them in person. There's a large body of literature that says that if you ask people for something in person, they are typically pretty likely to help you. If you ask them in writing or even by the phone, a little less likely. what could you ask for in person? Well, you could say, I'm having a really hard time. Could you check on me? I'm having a really hard time. If I reach out to you, want to get together after work for a cup of coffee, could you join me? I've got something, it's kind of uncomfortable happening in terms of how I'm feeling. Could I talk to you about that? Now, there are safe zones and unsafe zones and all of that, but this is about beginning to be vulnerable with people as a way of getting your needs met, right? The other thing I would say, and we'll call that number 2, learning to be vulnerable with other people. The thing I would call number 3, and maybe it should have been number 1, but we'll make it number 3, has to do with learning enough about yourself that you can begin to identify warning signs that are telling you things are going off the rails. And these warning signs are things you can attend to that will say, hey, I need to lean in a little more to my self-care. And you're going to ignore these warning signs, just to let you know, and I will too. You're going to ignore them at your great peril. And here's an example. So we moved to California from Kalamazoo. I mentioned that. We moved from Kalamazoo to Vanderbilt. This was 22 years ago. So it's been a great run here. And when we moved here, I had a little Mazda called a 323. It was a little hatchback. Some of you have maybe heard me tell this story, so forgive me. But I noticed one day the check engine light came on in that car. And gosh, I was busy. I was a resident and I was always in a hurry. And I thought, you know, how important is a check engine light anyway? Probably not very. And I had a note card in my car. This is a true story, actually. And I took the note card and I put it over the check engine light. And I thought, wow, this is amazing. There's no check engine light now. This is pretty cool. I just fixed my car. And I just kept driving and kept driving and driving and driving. And one day, actually one evening, in West Nashville, near where the Costco is now, I thought, wow, this is really funny. My car is shaking. That's kind of weird. And then I noticed, wow, my car has lost power. That's kind of strange. And my car died by the side of the road. The engine seized up, no oil. I had ignored the check engine light. Now, that car wasn't worth a lot of money. It was worth more than the $50 I got, though, at the scrap metal yard. I sold it there the next day. It was totaled, had to get another car. And in that car, actually one day, my wife and I headed to the Outer Banks, if anybody's been there. And we had a little baby in tow, and we had a big wahoo, a fish that I had caught that we were headed home with. I was excited to have wahoo steaks. And my wife said, you know, Jim, the car sounds a little funny. This was a different car. This was a minivan. This is a story I haven't told before. And I said, no, I don't think anything's wrong with the car. It sounds just fine, honey. And she said, well, I'm not sure, Jim. And I said, it's fine. And somewhere around Durham, North Carolina, the transmission went out. And that's a whole other story. What's the point? The point is that we can avoid things, right? And when we avoid things, they begin to catch up to us. And warning signs that suggest that we're avoiding in this self-care arena can include a variety of things. It could include things like, wow, I'm having problems sleeping. I'm getting really irritable, and that's not usually the case. I'm isolating, right? I've got a circle of friends, but I'm not very engaged with them. People are calling me, I'm not returning their calls. People are texting me, I'm not very engaged. I had a drinking problem back in the day, if you did. Wow, I've started to return to drinking a little bit, right? I've got a close friend who lives in another state, and we've been out of touch, she and I, for a couple of years. And just life happened, good friends, no problem. And I got a text from her. She lives in California. And she said, Jim, this happened about a month ago. She said, Jim, I'd love to talk to you. And I said, I'd love to talk to you. I've missed you. And she texted me and we talked. And she said, you know, I'm just out of the hospital. And I said, you're just out of the hospital? And she said, yeah. And I said, gosh, like what was wrong? Like medically, what was wrong? And she said, Jim, it was a psychiatric hospital. I tried to kill myself and my jaw about dropped. This high achieving, high functioning professional who is so capable. And she said, I was dealing with depression, and the thing of it is, it just snuck up on me. I didn't really see it coming, just snuck up on me. And the next thing I knew, I was contemplating killing myself. And the next thing I knew, I was in the ER, and things have kind of gone downhill from there. So she's making a comeback, and I'm confident actually that she's going to be okay. But the point is that these things can sneak up, right? These problems can sneak up, and we want to pay attention. We want to be introspective, and we want to be thoughtful, and we want to be reflective about our processes. And if things are changing and they're changing in a big way, we want to attend to those, right? To use the example with my car, it would have been a simple fix, right? Like I passed Valvoline probably 100 times with that index card over the check engine light, right? Was I really too busy to pull over and take care of the oil? Probably not, right? Would that have been better? It would have. So I want you to consider that there are warning signs, blinking lights that can say, hey, I've got to attend to this. And if those are the things you're hearing, we can attend to these things by reaching out to other people, by being vulnerable, by making deposits in our bank. There are other things that are impactful also. There's a lot of evidence, for instance, that shows that if people spend even 15 or 30 minutes a week in nature, they're much happier, right? If they get even a little bit of exercise, they do much better. If they engage with other people relationally, they find themselves thriving more. Things that we all can do. On the continuum of self-care, at one end is, I'm going to have a cup of tea and watch a Hallmark Christmas movie if that's what I enjoy, and I'm going to feel a little better, right? That's a minimal intervention. A bigger one would be, I'm going to pick up the phone and I'm going to call a psychologist or a therapist, right? And that's something that you, again, should have in your armamentarium of options. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand if you've been to therapy, but gosh, I have. And it's been one of the most transformative things in my life. And for those of you who haven't, a good therapist, there are a lot of misconceptions about this. A good therapist is not going to say, hey, lay down on the couch and I'm going to psychoanalyze you and ask you about your mother, ask you about your potty training, all the things that happen in movies and in people's nightmares, right? It's much more practical. What are your goals? How can I help you get there? How can we engage these things? It's not so scary, right? So thinking of engaging a professional can be a very helpful thing to do. When do you engage the professional? You engage the professional, I think, when you feel like, when you've concluded that these new symptoms that I'm describing are persisting, sleeping problems, return to old addictions, new relationship issues you didn't have before, when you can't solve them on their own, or when they are becoming severe enough that they are really disrupting, right? You've been successful at work forever, and now there are issues that have emerged. You haven't had relationship problems, and now you and your spouse or your partner are at odds all the time. These things are signs that things are going awry, right? And when these things are going awry, you need to attend to them. You need to attend to them, need to not ignore them, because they're really important. So I think I've talked for about 32 or 33, 4 minutes to be exact. I could keep going, but I think I'm going to stop here, and I'm glad to engage some questions. But by way of summary, let's put emotional deposits in the bank. Let's learn to be vulnerable and engage with other people. Let's state what our needs are and be about getting them met. Let's set boundaries that allow us to be more available to help other people, because Unfortunately, when we say yes to some things, we say no to other things. Let's put the big rocks in the fish tank first, so we have room for the small rocks. This is the short Cliff Notes version here, and let's not ignore warning signs. So Isaac, if people have questions, I'm glad to engage them.
Yeah, for sure. I have a question if no one else does, but if anyone has a question, feel free, you can put it in the chat if you can't, speak right now for whatever, if you're on your phone, you can't, do that. Chat, you can put it in the chat function, take yourself off mute. I'll get started just, while people have some time to think. You talked about boundaries and you shared the anecdote about going to Germany. That's more of a one-off thing. I guess, do you have any advice for, maybe you said yes to taking on an additional role at work and there's no sort of definitive end date for that, and you realize you crossed a boundary by accepting on that additional role? How do you, do you have any advice for like kind of dealing with that in a more kind of continuous manner?
Well, I think one thing that, so a couple things. One thing I have done, and again, I understand that this isn't always possible. There have been some times I have agreed to do something and I have gone back later and said, can we revisit this, please? This wasn't such a good idea for me. And I'm wondering if we can undo what I just did here, because I really don't have the bandwidth to do that. And when one of my employees comes to me with that, I'm pretty sympathetic. Usually it isn't always possible, but I think my first comment would be, don't be too proud to try to revisit that. And if you're stuck with it, if you're now stuck with it, I would say, let's determine not to take on other unnecessary things to make that task even harder. And let's pledge, if you will, that, and it doesn't always work this way, let's pledge, if you will, that when I'm done with this, I'm going to be a little more thoughtful about boundaries. And it's really about awareness, really. In the example I gave Isaac, as I mentioned, I was so quick to answer the question. The person said, really, you want to go? I haven't even told you what you're doing yet. And that should have been a warning for me, like, hey, hold on, boy, slow down a little bit here. Let them at least tell you. So I think when people approach me with big decisions that they want me to make that have implications for boundaries, if I can build even a little time in, hey, can I follow up with you about that tomorrow? That usually saves me, because when I step away, I'm like, I don't really think that's a good idea. And I think that'll be the experience of many people too. Try to build in a little time. I saw a comment in the chat. Would that person like to raise the question, or you want me to just read it? Carol?
Yeah, no, great advice for personal use for sure. But I definitely know that there are some managers at some of our facilities that we're working with who are trying to figure out how to assist the folks that work for them. And they sound like do the tips translate in that direction?
I think so. I think they really do. And I think, again, there are boundaries that can't be set, right? There are jobs that have to be done. But I think encouraging these tips for everybody, including the people that work with us or for us, I think is very appropriate. And I think vulnerability is really important here, because I think it's important for managers, for leaders to model this for other people, because in modeling vulnerability, you're giving people permission to struggle also, right? Like if I take my mask off, then you feel like you can take your mask off too, right? And if we all have our masks off, is quite lovely, right? But if I have my mask on, you're often very disinclined to take your mask off. So as I'm vulnerable with you, you're vulnerable with me. And as that process happens, we're often able to get down to what the real issues are. And that's what I encourage, Carol, as a supervisor or a leader or a manager. Brene Brown writes about this a lot, and I would really commend her work. It's very helpful and practical. Her newest book is called Atlas of the Heart, which I would really recommend. It's sitting on my little coffee table right now. So Brene Brown is a great resource, but beginning to have the courage to be vulnerable as a manager and realizing that sets the tone, very important. Other questions? I think somebody had their hand up.
Yes, thanks, Dr. Jackson. So you kind of mentioned exactly what I was asking, because I know you mentioned boundaries and Atlas of the Heart. Are there any other resources that you would recommend? You know, we're always strapped for time.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
anything we can do in our own time.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are two great books, and Brene Brown has written so many. I mean, I don't know that I would name one more than the other, but they're all really good. B-R-E-N-E, Brene Brown. I also really like the book Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, F-R-A-N-K-L, which is an older book. But I think it's a very helpful book. It's pretty thin. I mean, you could read it, Anna, pretty quickly. But Viktor Frankl, you know, was a physician in a concentration camp. And so basically the gist of his message there is that, and I probably should have mentioned this, is that if you can find meaning, if you can impute meaning to things, you can cope with really hard things, right? And so I think one of the messages during the pandemic that has resonated with me and resonated with other people is this idea that, gosh, I can do harder things than I even think I can if I can frame this as meaningful work, right? How do I find meaning in things, and how do I use meaning to propel me, to give me the strength to hang in there? That's Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. So anything by Brene Brown, Boundaries by Cloud and Townsend, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Those are three books that I'd recommend. I should say too that I'm writing a book, and it's coming out in May, actually, of 2023. I'm not trying to promote it here, and it is actually about long COVID. That's the primary topic, but it's very practical. And if you want to understand maybe how your patients experience long COVID, and learn about concepts like post-traumatic growth and other things, the book might be of use to you. It's called Clearing the Fog, coming out in May. You can order it now on Amazon. I'm always reluctant to mention it, but I think it could be a good resource in the context of COVID, Clearing the Fog.
Yeah, definitely. Sounds interesting to me. Anyone else have any questions? If not, we can give folks a few minutes back in their day and maybe get people to lunch a little early. All right, it doesn't seem like it. If you have a question and just don't want to ask it right now, you can always email it to me, and then I can pass it along to Dr. Jackson kind of after the fact. But I want to thank you, Dr. Jackson. That was really, really great. I really enjoyed your talk, and I took notes myself. So looking forward to hopefully implementing some of these things. I think self-care is something that everyone can always take a refresher course on and emphasize and benefit to listening from. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, I agree, Isaac. Thank you for the opportunity. And folks, friends, if you want to email me directly, it'll be my pleasure, and glad to help you. So thanks, guys.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Jackson. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.